Good morning. Today is, let's see, it's Thursday, January 12th, 2017. And as you all know, the big stories lately in the news have been about what's been called fake news. Fake news is everywhere. And for fun, I went to Google this morning and ran up a thing to see how many stories are out there on this subject right now. It was 162 million. What we're going to talk about today are 5 stories that are not so much fake news, but become fake news by the way they're focused on by the media and how the media can get you to believe things. And this isn't, I'm not talking about some right-wing or left-wing, crazy website. I'm talking about the mainstream media, MSN, ABC, CBS, Wall Street Journal, all those media, Washington Post. And we're going to talk about 5 stories this morning that are absolutely misrepresented in the minds of the American people. Because the American people will believe anything the mainstream media says and don't listen or follow the stories themselves as they're happening too often. And you end up with these. The first and one of the big ones is the Trayvon Martin story and how he was murdered by George Zimmerman in a ruthless killing. A lot of Americans actually still believe that. They didn't follow the case, and I'll go through it. The hands up, don't shoot story. This was about Michael Brown in Ferguson, how he was gunned down by Officer Wilson. Also a total fib, and was proven to be so even by the Department of Justice. How Edward Snowden fled to Moscow. This is a popular one that's gotten a lot of traction. The White House has been saying it. The Republicans are saying it. Edward Snowden is a national treasure for what he did, and releasing those documents in the NSA. And then you have the Syrian Red Line and how John Kerry got some of the credit for getting Assad to give up his chemical weapons, and what the Red Line resulted in gets very little attention. And then the Benghazi story, No Time to Send Help, which has since been found to be absolutely untrue, that they could have. And there's an email that came out a little over a year ago that got zero attention in the media. Zero. No one talked about it. But we're going to talk about it, and you're going to find out how you've been influenced by very poor reporting by our own media. All right. The first case is here. The woman in this picture is Rachel Gentile. You may remember her. She testified. Well, if you didn't follow the Zimmerman Martin case, you don't remember her. You won't know who she is. But she was Martin's girlfriend, or good friend anyway, who was talking to him on the night of the shooting when Martin got killed, when Trayvon was shot. She was talking to him at the time when he was leaving the scene. He had already confronted and had sort of a run-in with George Zimmerman, and he was going home. Okay? Trayvon Martin was going home. He was out of sight of Zimmerman. He had gone back to his father's fiance's house and was talking to her for about 18 minutes. And as he talked, he got angrier and angrier. Now, you have to bear in mind that the Trayvon Martin you saw in the media, that cute little 12-year-old kid, is not the kid that got in the fight. The Trayvon Martin of the time of the shooting was a great, big, strong 17-year-old kid. He was about 6 feet tall. Had a history of fights. Had a long record of getting kicked out of school for violence. He was not a good kid. Let's just say it. I'm not saying that Zimmerman wasn't a total asshole. He is, absolutely. But Trayvon Martin was no angel either. And this is what happens when two idiots meet each other. At any rate, Trayvon Martin told Gentile, she begged him not to, by the way, to go back, and she went back. And the aftermath was that he ended up apparently punching Zimmerman. They got into a fight, and Zimmerman got the crap kicked out of him. The back of his head was all banged up from hitting the ground. He had grass stains up and down his back, and Zimmerman shot him. And there's more than a little evidence that Martin was on top of him, getting the best of him. And that's what happens, okay? So the jury couldn't find Zimmerman guilty of murder because the evidence didn't lead to it. And this includes black jurors. There were black jurors there who agreed that it was probably not a murder but self-defense under the Florida law. And then you have this wonderful story. Hands up, don't shoot. This was one of the great frauds perpetrated by the American media regarding this guy here. This is Michael Brown Jr. he was a pretty bad dude, and got into an altercation down in Ferguson, and you all know the story. And the Department of Justice under Obama went in there to try to prove the case that this was pure violence against a black man, unwarranted by a white racist cop. The DOJ spent a fortune on DNA and ballistics and other investigations. The FBI did its own investigation. The victim's family did their own investigation. And what they found out was that the hands up story wasn't corroborated by the ballistic or DNA evidence in multiple witness statements that came out. The other thing they found was that a lot of the witness statements were either completely retracted or heavily altered once they were re-interviewed, and they found out that a lot of the people that claimed to be there weren't even there. They were somewhere else and created testimony based on what they heard from other people who were fibbing about it. And in the end, the officer wasn't found guilty because it was shown through DNA and whatnot that Brown did try to take the gun out of the cruiser. He climbed into the car, he assaulted the cop, and the cop shot him. End of story. And then you have this case. Edward Snowden flees Hong Kong from Moscow, asks Ecuador to grant asylum. This was sort of like the original story, but it's not the story that's been spun since then. If you pay attention to the media, you know that the White House and Republicans, John McCain and others, have all been saying that Edward Snowden fled to the Russians. He fled to Moscow because the Russia is our new boogeyman. The reality is that Edward Snowden was in Hong Kong working with WikiLeaks, trying to find a way to get to Ecuador, where he had basically permission to go there. And they arranged for him to fly from Hong Kong through Moscow to Havana, through Havana, out and down to Ecuador. And during this time period, the U.S. government had actually asked the Chinese to turn him over. And the Chinese refused. They claimed they didn't have the right paperwork. The reality is the Chinese were mad at the Obama administration for some of the things that had gone on, and the relationship wasn't that such that they were willing to cooperate. So Snowden got on the plane in Hong Kong and left. And by the time he got to Moscow, the State Department had, guess what? They had canceled his visa and his passport. So once he landed in Moscow in the transit zone, he had a couple-hour wait to get on his next plane. He found out that he couldn't get on the next plane because of lack of papers. So in effect, the White House and the State Department handed Edward Snowden on a silver platter over to the Russian government. And he sat in that terminal. If you think back, if you remember, do you remember Edward Snowden spent 7 days or more in that transit zone at the Moscow airport trying to find a way to get out? Putin didn't detain him. Nobody detained him. He just couldn't leave. No plane would take him. And eventually, to break the stalemate, Putin said, fine, stay here until you can figure out something. Originally, it was going to be for 1 year, but then they extended it because there still isn't any place for Mr. Snowden to go. But in today's world, as the news gets regurgitated and used over and over and over again, basically they're trying to paint him as a defector, which is a total bullshit story. Excuse my French. And then you have this story. Kerry got Assad to turn over the chemical weapons. The problem is that Kerry actually laughed at the idea when it was first proposed to him after the Assad regime crossed Obama's red line and wimped out on making any response. If you all remember, what happened there was that the Obama administration, quote, drew a red line threatening immediate consequences if the Assad government used chemical weapons on their own people. The Assad regime did use them. Obama did nothing. He completely wimped out. He is a pussy, after all. And what happened? Nothing. Except that the rebels and the Syrian people suddenly realized the United States does not have our back, and it created a wonderful vacuum, and it allowed these former Al-Qaeda guys that formed a new group inside Syria to basically take over the revolution. And they are the rascals that were in Aleppo for the last year or two that we were in the news so much lately. You may remember that, and everybody was accusing the Russians of bombing them. Yeah, well, of course they are. They were bombing these guys because they were terrorists. And the people that came out of Aleppo afterwards quickly pointed out that they were very glad that the Russians were doing what they were doing to help them. At any rate, back to the chemical weapons story. Kerry laughed at the idea that Assad would turn over his chemical weapons, and what happened? Vladimir Putin stepped in within an hour or two, I think, of this, called Assad, got Assad to do it, called Kerry up and said, you can have your chemical weapons, we'll get them out. And they created sort of an international group to go in and remove them, and they were removed. The problem that no one talks about is that those rebels, those former Al-Qaeda guys that we were talking about, went in and took some of the raw materials that were left over from the chemical weapons removal program, and they had them, and there's more than a little evidence to indicate that they've been using them. So much for that story. All right, so the red line and the chemical weapons story is bullcrap. It was Putin that did it. All right, and then you have this. The military assistance, or the lack of it, into Benghazi on the night of that famous attack. And at the time, and since then, the story has been put forward that there was no time to get anybody there, so no order was put together to send people immediately. And they did instead send people through Tripoli, and then eventually down to Benghazi to remove the corpses the next day. This has never happened before in American history. If an American installation or base or anything connected with the government, especially an ambassador, is under attack, they scramble everybody in sight within an hour. They send everyone, as they say. In this case, they didn't. They sent nobody, and they argued that they wouldn't have been able to get there in time. The problem is that at the time they made the decision, they didn't know how long the attack was going to last, did they? How could they? Some of these attacks can go on for days. What they were really trying to do was find a way to get this situation cleared up without any focus being put on that CIA annex that was heavily involved in a weapons transfer program. They'd been there for over 2 years. They started by bringing in weapons through Yemen with Mr. Mark Turi. And now that the revolution was over, they had 50 CIA, 45 CIA operatives there working with State Department people trying to gather up weapons. They were putting them on ships, sending them to Turkey, and were now being used to supply the rebels. And eventually they all ended up in the hands of Al-Qaeda groups or former Al-Qaeda groups. But this is the most shocking thing. If you've missed this, this happened just a year ago, December 8, 2015, a little over a year ago. Through a FOIA request, Judicial Watch got a memo, an email that was sent the night of the attack. And it said, this was written by a guy named Jeremy Bash. Very important fellow. He works for the U.S. Department of Defense Chief of Staff. Okay, that's a big job. That's a big job. And the email sent to the top State Department officials the night of the attack at 7:19 Eastern Time, just hours after the attack began. Bash said, "We have identified the forces that could move to Benghazi. They are spinning up as we speak." They never left the ground. All right? This document was not turned over during the original investigation. The Obama administration cited a Freedom of Information Act exemption that allows the withholding of documents considered to be part of the deliberative process, which is absolute BS. This was information that was sent to let them know they were sending people. This wasn't deliberative. This was actual information. It doesn't matter. The reality is that they were going to send people and they didn't, but they were afraid of exposing what was going on in Benghazi and at the mission, and with the former operative, now an ambassador, Mr. Christopher Stevens. And that's the story. All right, so dig a little deeper the next time you read the news and you accept on face value what you're hearing. All right, bye.